Hello there. Is open source software in peril? Is this the end for the OSS community? Well, that is what we're here to answer. Hello and welcome to the Cloud Therapist channel. I'm Richard Simon. Today we are talking about open source and more importantly around open source licensing, what's been happening recently. I think there is a great disturbance in the open source, if I can borrow a phrase from Star Wars. We're going to basically just kind of go through some of the recent events, the impact of all of that, and really how sort of enterprises can sort of steer and maybe kind of talk a little bit around sort of strategy steering around that and so on. So let me do some introductions first. Well, I'll actually ask my guests to do introductions rather than kind of me butchering all the details. So Amanda, if I can ask you to please start first.
Thank you. Nice to be with you today. I'm Amanda Brock. I'm CEO at an organization called Open UK. We're an industry organization, bit of a think tank, and we bring together the open tech community's software, hardware, data, standards, and AI. My own background is that I was a lawyer for 25 years. Don't hate me. I'm no longer one, or I try not to be. I've been running Open UK for almost exactly 5 years now and shifted away from that, but brought many of the people who I've worked with in open source over the last 16 years, who are based in the UK, to the organization.
Fantastic. Cheryl?
Hi, everyone. My name's Cheryl. I'm a senior director at ARM, but I'm previously an engineer at Google and Apple and also VP at the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, where I was working full-time on open source and promoting open source and the community.
Fantastic. Cristian, please.
Yeah, so my name is Cristian. I'm former open source contributor. So I was working for many years as contributor of many open source projects, had a few of my own. At some point was working at AWS and contributing to the open source as part of my employment. And then afterwards left AWS, and now I'm a solopreneur and still doing open source whenever I can.
Fantastic. Okay, well, thank you all for making this session. I think it's going to be great to go through some of these topics and kind of see where things are going in the future as well. Okay, so let's start a little bit with history. Cristian, you and I, when we kind of exchanged notes about what to talk about and so on, we were kind of very passionate about this space. I think there was a lot going on at the time when we actually put those notes down as well. So maybe just kind of take us through a little bit of this sort of the open source sort of history, just briefly on that, and then just kind of bring us up to some of the recent developments and what you've seen in things like OSI, GPL, and things like that.
Yeah, so open source started way decades ago, like in the 80s. In some universities where people were sharing code with each other, and then at some point the university started to like limit their ability to share code. So then they kind of built this entire open source free software foundation, came out of that while working on the Unix software source code. And eventually there was always a tension between these idealists of people like contributing and building software for out of passion with businesses that had different interests, and they were trying to make money out of this. So there was always like the people, the contributors often would take some source code, building some open source alternatives to commercial software, and then businesses started to notice this and started to use it kind of against each other in a competitive way. And then eventually there was this open source initiative that was kind of trying to make it in a way official, that people can use open source for business under certain terms. And out of that came a lot of, let's say, licenses that are compliant with the open source initiative, and then companies started to use it big time. And there was the dot-com boom 25 years ago, and open source was front and center as part of that. And then, yeah, over the years, many projects became really popular, like the Linux kernel, and yeah, Android was also eventually open sourced by Google, and then like the browsers with Chrome. And so nowadays, if you're using a computer, chances are like 80% of the software you use have open source foundations of sorts, including like things like the Mac operating system we are using on our computers is largely open source. Also, a lot of the infrastructure under the hood is open source when it comes to compilers, and also like the browsers and all these tools increasingly are becoming open source. And there was always this tension between the business world and the individual contributors, as I was saying. And eventually, as companies started to use it, they started to make a lot of projects, use them in ways that contribute to their marketing. Like I was mentioning, Android and Chrome by Google. And also, it has also all sorts of nice effects when it comes to letting people to look for security issues, and improving the software collectively, as like it happened also with the Linux kernel, where thousands and thousands of developers with all sorts of different interests joined forces and built something that's really powerful. Over the last few years, with the revolution in the cloud computing space, what happened was that a lot of these companies that were using open source maybe to gain traction in the marketplace, maybe like a startup that could build a tool and then make an open source version of their product as a way to attract customers to their paid offering. Eventually, the cloud providers started to use open source increasingly and offering open source software in a managed way, maybe like you can see with the databases. And a lot of the vendors lately that were offering these projects, they eventually started to change the licensing in ways that are no longer aligning with the principles outlined back in the 90s with the open source initiative. Right. And then cloud providers basically, they insisted, oh, this has to be open source. We will run it as open source. And then many of these projects were forked. We can talk about that, but basically there are like alternative directions that one of them remained open source and the other one is now a commercial offering. And that's kind of the recent trend that I've seen.
Okay, cool, excellent. Well, thank you for that. I think actually, it was interesting to just kind of get that sort of background on that first. So let's kind of dive into the more kind of recent events, as you said, and kind of the license changes. So obviously this has been going on for a while. It's not kind of just recently. I mean, I remember when Oracle acquired Sun Microsystems, they acquired part of the acquisition was Star Office. That changed into Oracle OpenOffice, and then everybody forked from that and went on to LibreOffice. At least the open source community did anyway. I also have covered sort of this area in the sort of previous episodes as well. There's one, I think, from the April episode of Cloud State of Play, so do check that out. I'll try and drop some links in the description for that. Also, I think we did another discussion from the July episode as well of Cloud State of Play, which was the future of open source software. So we're kind of looking a little bit more about sort of the viability of the model going forward. Okay, so certainly recent sort of changes have been the major impact, which is probably why, and there's actually been a lot of ink spilt on on that as well recently. For example, the Red Hat sort of thing, I think that's been a couple of big blows on that. The Register, I think, called it Red Hat crushes downstream, as in downstream projects. That was kind of the headline that they put out. But the initial one was kind of their stopping the support for CentOS, which is a downstream project from Red Hat Enterprise Linux. And then more recently, it was kind of really the making their open source code really less available, shall we say, a little bit more limited. So again, there were forks around that. So we've seen things like Rocky Linux, Alma Linux, the Open ELA, which is the Open Enterprise Linux Association, being created, and all those guys kind of being into that. So there's been a lot of effects around that, that sort of those decisions by Red Hat specifically. Yeah, does anybody kind of remember some of the reactions around the sort of the Red Hat decisions?
I actually don't think those were the big ones. I think the sort of the really big ones were probably the Mongo, then looking at Elastic, and then HashiCorp a year ago, 18 months ago almost now. And I think those have led to a complete shift in the place of a fork. And I think in some ways those are probably even bigger than, the ones that you're talking about there, Richard.
Yeah. Cheryl, what about you? Any kind of from your sort of developer side, what's your sort of take on these things? What have you heard?
Yeah, I'd agree with Amanda that all of those ones she mentioned, Mongo and Elastic and so on, those were quite a shock in the community. And also last year, I believe Linkerd made the decision to not have the releases be open source. So the code would be, but not the releases. So that's a new level of distinction that we haven't seen, where the presumption was that, if the source code is open source, then you would also package the releases and release those for free, to use as open source as well. So I think that was a new development and perhaps another trend that we could be seeing.
Yeah. And yeah, I think the other one I picked up on was Sentry as well. I think they made some. So I mean, there's been we're not kind of we're only picking on those because we've kind of seen those in the headlines, and they've been kind of been reported on a lot. But there is a lot going on there in that. I think the Redis one, I think, was also with that got forked to Valkey, I think, recently, because they went to something called the Redis source available license and the server-side public license. So yeah, lots of different names to get used to there. But I think these are all kind of been impacting this space recently. Amanda, why do you think that kind of all this is happening? What do you think are some of the drivers? I think Cristian kind of touched on it, but if you can elaborate a little bit more.
Yeah, I think Cristian gave it quite a nice sort of segue into that, which is that when open source started, we had this university collaboration. It sort of stopped in the 60s even, because copyright was applied to code. So lawyers decided that code would have copyright. That meant that other people couldn't just collaborate, they had to have a license. And then you fast forward to about 30 years ago, early 90s, and you end up with open source definition. There's 10 points in that definition. For a license to be open source, it has to comply with those. And the easiest way to be sure that it has is to check that the OSI has approved it. And I think there's somewhere between 80 and 100 licenses, more than we actually need. And there's about 6 of them that get used all the time. So you're in a situation where you have a system which is kind of a belief system, right? People are doing open source because they think it's the way to collaborate. They're not doing it necessarily as a business model, and it evolves through foundations as a way for companies to collaborate. And I think what open source is many different things to different people. Fundamentally, it's this legal definition. You make the source available, you put an open source initiative approved or OSD compliant license on it. But then it's many different things depending on where you've come from, whether you think it's a community exercise, whether you think it's about corporate collaboration, or whether you think it's a business model. And one very prominent open source founder was shouting at me when I came off stage a couple of years ago because I'd said open source is not a business model. And it just isn't. It's a way, whatever you think it is, it's not a business model. It's a way for people to develop software. It's a way of collaborating. If you think it's going to magically make you money, you're on a highway to nothing. How you make money out of open source is the holy grail. And it's become the holy grail because people see adoption and want to build businesses. And then more and more people start from this point of, I'm going to open source it because I'm going to make money. And I've put loads of people off open sourcing when I was still a lawyer. And I used to say to them, what if? What if somebody else takes your code and uses it? And they understood that was the basis of an open source license. What if somebody uses it and makes money? Often they don't understand that. Even today, people often don't understand that you can't exclude commercialization. You can in things like Creative Commons, there's a non-commercial license there. But the fundamentals of open source and the open source definition are that anybody can use it for any purpose without restriction. So that commercialization restriction is often the bit people don't understand. And then the third thing I would have said to people is, what if they make a lot of money and you don't? And that was partly because I'd just come out of Canonical when I was advising people as a lawyer. And we were one of the first companies that went through this shift where we suddenly had, I think, over 70% of the cloud market, but we didn't have a business model sitting behind that to sustain it. And we didn't generate enough revenue. Now, for many different reasons, Canonical was able to survive that. Smaller businesses without that level of investment can't always do that. And that's really what's generated this. And people who are setting up open source businesses now should sort of know better. There's a clear history of business challenges. There is a question about whether open source is a suitable model for businesses, and particularly around single vendor companies. So we've got a single vendor product where the community is generally made up of people who either started life as employees or become employees. And you don't have this broad ranging collaborative community, because those products are the ones that tend, once they've IPO'd, once they've taken investment, to look at shifting. And a lot of founders will tell you now that when they talk to VCs, they're being asked when you're planning to shift. And you reference a bunch of licenses like SSPL, like the Redis license. Those licenses have all been drafted by one lawyer, actually, and the rest of us have all refused to do it. But those licenses sort of, I'm going to say bastardize in the correct term and not the sweary way, basic open source licensing, generally to add a restriction. And that restriction is generally around commercialization, because they don't want other people making money out of the software. And that should be a problem. And the shifts, you hear different reasons from companies about whether they're making revenue or not. There was a really nice short report from the folks at RedMonk saying that there is no proof that once companies have shifted license, they actually start to make more money than they were beforehand. So we don't know whether that really works, But what we have seen is customers fighting back, which I think is super interesting. So historically, a fork, lifting and shifting the code, creating a branch of the code so that you change the name and you carry on with a competing product. And it used to be that whoever got the most contributions in the future and had the best code base won. Who knows if that's still the case, but it was always the community tool, and it was where the community was able to keep leadership in check. And now when we see Valkey, and the way Valkey was spun out in 8 days by the Linux Foundation with Google and AWS. So you've got two massive users with commercial power working with the biggest open foundation in the world, able to spin up a competing product to stop that, effectively small player shifting away from open source. So that changes the landscape, I think.
Indeed. So so we kind of maybe started with that, and as you're actually sort of responding there, Amanda, I think I've kind of I can kind of see the distinction that you're sort of saying about sort of what open source was kind of started as an ideal, as you said, Cristian, as well, and then kind of trying to marry that with this sort of commercial approach is not necessarily the best thing. So Cheryl, is kind of forking then the only way forward for everybody? Is there anything else we can do? What's kind of the impact? What are you hearing from sort of a developer point of view on stuff like this?
Well, so I'm a developer myself by background. So I am an idealist. I do believe that open source is a common good, and it is something that we should.
And if we stick to that model, right? If people kind of, because we've had things like the AGPL and for all its kind of maybe faults and what have you, but people, when they've stuck to that model and they've offered something open source and built that community, blah blah blah, and then sure, you can make an enterprise version what you're doing, and license that and do a subscription. But sorry, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, open source has never been just one thing. You mentioned GPL, and now companies don't generally do GPL because it was not serving the needs of the companies. But, as I said, I am an idealist, and I do believe as a developer, it's wonderful to use open source for free. And in general, developers actually probably care less than we think that they do. They're just like, oh, it's free, I'll use it. No, no biggie. But having also worked on the other side, having worked for the Linux Foundation and seen how these big companies, the point of the Linux Foundation is to ensure that open source has this sustainable business model behind it. And the Linux Foundation's solution to this was get companies to donate into a foundation, and those companies, that money supports some level of common infrastructure. So technical writers, marketing, events, that kind of thing. But also importantly, it held the trademarks. So you can always put on a license. Yes, you can commercialize this, but no, you cannot label it Kubernetes, for instance. Not that Kubernetes doesn't follow this model, but let's say, you can't call it our trademarked name for your commercial version of it. But I would say, like, back to your original question, like, is this the only solution out there? I don't think so. But having said that, I also don't think that anything is static. Just because this is the situation that we're in today does not imply that in 20 years' time, let's say like Linux is still going to be Linux. I mean, Linux is probably the strongest version of it, but many, many projects live and die, and that is the natural life cycle of an open source project.
Yeah, indeed. Okay, yes. I mean, I think also, Amanda, you touched on it in terms of the commercial side, acquisitions, looking at sustainable models and answering to shareholders, which is, again, I touched on in the previous conversations we had around this sort of sustainability of those models, probably contributes to that as well. Hey, if you are enjoying the content, please don't forget to subscribe to the channel. That would really help me out. Thank you. So let's kind of just a little bit move on to a little bit around these sort of recent alternative licenses. I have to admit, and again, as you said, Amanda, there's only probably one lawyer who understands all of this, and he or she's probably making lots of money at the moment out of all the sort of contracts they're having to do. But things like in a business source license, this is I think moved on to the functional source license, or FSL, so BSL or BUSL, some people call it, and moved on to the FSL. These are the new models. We'll try and provide some details in the description for all of this, by the way, if you're kind of interested.
I think it's worth saying that those aren't, Richard, I think it's just worth being clear that those are not open source licenses.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I think
that's
so these are the kind of the new ones that I think people have moved on to. So things like Terraform, HashiCorp, Terraform.
Yeah.
Kind of gone
Again, I think I would be careful, because when you say people have moved on to it, implies that people are moving to them at scale, and they're really not.
Yeah. Well, vendors are, I
agree.
Yeah, absolutely.
A few.
Yeah, a few vendors, yeah. let's hope it stays like that. Okay. So Cristian, do we know anything about this? I mean, what is what is your kind of take? Because you've been kind of quite close to development and things like that as well.
Yeah. I mean, I'm part of I'm a DevOps engineer as by background, so I've been following very closely the HashiCorp OpenTofu situation. And yeah, at some point I actually did an analysis of the level of contributions of the community. I mean, when they launched OpenTofu, there was this pledge list of hundreds and hundreds of people who were like, yeah, we will assign 1 developer, we will assign 10 developers, whatever. And then a lot of people were like, I'm just going to support a project. And then I think after half a year or a year, I had a look at the GitHub history and level of contributions, and it was clear that the community didn't really step up to the level of contribution that they pledged to offer. And I mean, it's costly to assign, like if you're a small company, it's costly to assign 5 people of your maybe 20 developers to work full time on the project. But on the other hand, HashiCorp had the money to fund like maybe double the number of people that were contributing combined across all the other companies who pledged to OpenTofu. So basically, there is this sometimes they fork, and then the fork like get some traction, but not at the level that it was hoped or expected when it started.
Okay.
So yeah, that's something that I've seen. Another thing that I see is in the space of like single contributors. Like you have all these people who work as a full-time employee somewhere, and then in their spare time they follow their passion, and then they build something that might be very interesting for them. So for example, nowadays a lot of people are building AI projects, right? So this is kind of the trend. You don't see so many more projects built in other areas. Like not so many people are building, let's say, open source operating systems like it was the case 30 years back with Linux. Nowadays, projects kind of tend to follow the let's say the hype cycles of certain technologies. And what's interesting with this is that these people who like don't have really a financial interest, they just do it out of passion, and they want to do something interesting to them, something cool in their projects. Eventually, they, as the technology becomes more mature in that area, they try to come up with ways to commercialize some of those projects. Eventually, maybe they burn out, they don't have the capacity to contribute anymore, and many of those projects eventually die out. So that's kind of also part of the cycle. And yeah, just a few of them maybe get enough traction to survive. And a lot of the thing is that I was in the similar situation with my own project. So I started project auto spotting as open source, and then eventually I got busy at work and kind of didn't have bandwidth to work on it anymore. And then when I became a solopreneur, I wanted to work on it, but then I needed the money. So I kind of went into a similar direction of trying to monetize it and failing. And yeah, basically the project is pretty much dormant nowadays, just because I have to focus on other things. Sure. So yeah, that's also the like all this creativity of all these individual developers contributes a lot to the commons. But then when it comes to them making a living or in a sustainable way out of those projects, most of them fail. And yeah, some of those projects get taken over by enterprises, and then they become kind of a different thing.
Okay, sure. So, excellent. Okay, so Amanda, we're hearing a lot of this kind of new license and what have you. The new term I've been hearing a lot about is open washing. What is open washing?
So it's pretty simple. Open washing is implying that something is open source when it's not. So it comes from the concept of whitewashing, painting over something. And it's this idea that you are getting the benefit of open source without paying the price. And the price is that you're effectively enabling your competitors with your own innovation when you do open source. So that's the price you pay. And the benefit you get is largely adoption and engagement. So you have the ability to have people contribute to your project through community engagement. You have the likelihood, if you've got something really good, that it will become massively adopted or even a de facto standard because it's freely distributed. You know, Cristian was talking about a lot of it being developers' challenges. So a lot of the open source stuff is really the developer tools and the infrastructure rather than the sort of icing on the cake. Sometimes, you know, when talking to politicians, we talk about a pizza and we talk about all the different kinds of tech that sit on top of it, internet, cloud, blockchain, whatever you're looking at, AI, ML. And then underneath it is a base that people aren't interested in generally. And that's the bit that the engineering people are interested in, the base of the pizza, but it's absolutely essential. Without it, you haven't got one.
Sure, sure.
Yeah.
And you guys, I think you put out a post recently as well on LinkedIn, and it was kind of talking a little bit about sort of the license shift and open washing again, forking in the open source software. It was James Governor from Red Monk and Dawn Foster from Chaos. Again, Dawn's been actually on the channel before, so I'll drop links to the discussion with her as well.
And Richard, it might be worth I know Cristian said he'd had a look at the repos. Don's been analyzing at Chaos in quite a lot of depth, different repos. So I think one of the interesting things is when AWS forked Elasticsearch into OpenSearch, the contribution was really low. And then about a year later, it moved into Linux Foundation, and she was telling me that the contribution went up. So she's got a really good analysis of that. And I know she's doing quite a lot of speaking and writing about it.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, yeah, definitely something to follow up on. I think as this sort of thing, morphs and develops, there's going to be lots of sort of things to discuss, definitely. So Cheryl, just come to you very briefly on sort of, again, we mentioned a little bit about the impact, but I'm kind of interested a little bit more about sort of diving deeper into that sort of developer and also the enterprises kind of using these things. We've kind of heard a little bit about the revolt maybe happening from enterprises, but what is your kind of, what have you seen, what are you hearing in terms of enterprises and maybe developers in those enterprises, and even maybe for ARM, kind of what is happening in that, and how do you see, I don't know, maybe how can we get around some of these sort of changes as well?
Well, so we've talked, is open source sustainable and so on. And let me flip the question. Is software sustainable without open source? No.
Good one.
Right? No. I think we would all agree. Anyone who has any technical background or interest in technology would understand that there is no scale of company like Microsoft and Google and everything without the open source that enables that. So the question is not, can we try and hide it and like stick our head in the floor, in the ground like an ostrich and, try and hide from it. It is, what can we do to incentivize these companies to, maybe enable their developers to spend time on it, or if not hire people full time, as Cristian mentioned, because it is challenging for companies to do that. But we have to come up with a solution for it. There is no way around it, because we cannot sustain the kind of technology economy we have without the open source underneath it. And so I think for companies who are looking into this, first of all, I would say, as I said before, most developers probably actually don't care all that much. For them, it's a tool that, solves a purpose and it needs to be done. And that's all they will only ever be a user for it. So we should acknowledge that is a perfectly valid viewpoint from an enterprise, that they are users, they're not going to be contributors. But I do think that for companies that go beyond a certain size, especially companies that don't directly sell this software, but there is still value to them. So for example, ARM is primarily a hardware company, but has tons and tons of software investments in compilers and operating systems, because all of this enables the stack of everything else to work on top of the ARM architecture. And it's worth, funding perhaps an open source office to look at this within the company, and growing this from a systematic way, rather than just going, oh, you're a developer, you like open source, okay, like here, work on your pet project. But look at it from the company's point of view and what would enable the company to greater success.
Excellent. Okay. So just very briefly, I'll maybe just go around and just ask you just got a 30-second response on these. What about sort of the impact of AI? Could somebody take an open source project, drop it into a generative AI model, and come up with something else completely, and then claim that that's kind of their own thing? Is that how we kind of say? I mean, we know the generative side, and can kind of generate code and a GitHub Copilot, stuff like that. That's fine. I think we're probably resigned to that happening. Whether it's actually good code or crap code, that's up to the developers. But what about just kind of the overall impact of generative AI in this kind of specific space of taking bits of code and then claiming that this rejigging it and then claiming this is a new project? Amanda, what's your view?
So just before we get onto that, I want to pick up on what Cheryl said there about
Sure.
funding enterprises, if that's okay.
Yep.
So we have something in Germany, Cristian, I think you're in Germany, called the Sovereign Tech Fund, which I believe now has 50 million a year to put into open source, which it's great that they've put it in place, but it's a pittance. It's nothing in the big picture, right? And I think one of the things that we have to see shift as well as companies is responsibility being taken by governments, those who fund innovation and investment. Currently, what they fund is innovation and not maintenance. And I think we need to see a shift in that investment from governments so that a fixed percentage at the very least is going to maintenance, and that maintenance goes across the ecosystem, as well as looking at how and what they fund going forward generally. I think that maintenance piece is critical. And I believe we are actually seeing, I know in the UK, it's being discussed. Right. So I assume if we're doing it, everybody's doing it. And I believe that we're going to see a shift there and more money coming into it. Because as Cheryl says, you flip the question, and she's absolutely right. You can't have software and you can't have sustainable software without open source. So on the AI piece, I'm not going to steal all the thunder. I have a piece that I'm writing just now for the New Stack about exactly what you are saying happened, because it did happen. And there was an open source project.
Okay. That was a pure guess on my side, by the way.
Yeah, well, there was a US open source project, which I'm writing about, a California open source project, which was AI copied. And in doing that AI copy, they have breached the licensing, because licensing, we're not the Wild West, and licensing has requirements. And one that's almost universal is attribution. And basically this AI just took the code without attributing, and the people behind it took it without attributing. And they didn't follow a lot of the good practices that we'd expect to see in place in open source. So they're sort of passing themselves off as creating something which was never theirs. So it is a real problem, and it's one we're going to have to talk about more, I think.
Cool. Okay, Cheryl, over to you.
Super interesting that, Amanda, you've already seen it kind of happen. I would have said it seems a long way off in being able to create a fully functioning clone of a project through AI. But I have no data to back that up. I only have my gut instinct, let's say, that AI can write code for small problems, but for large problems, I think we're yet to see a successful version of that.
Excellent. Cristian.
I mean, I'm heavily using the AI myself for my own use, and I see a lot of like speed up by using it. So basically, you could go and just like maybe convert from one language to another language. So maybe there's the initial open source is in Python, you convert it to Go. There's no way to see if it was the same source code, right? So the LLM would allow you to do that, but then again, you have to do the attribution and so on to play by the rules. So technically speaking, I think it's totally possible if the person or the group is motivated enough to spend time on. I mean, in my opinion, it's just reinventing the wheel, and it's like not so useful investment of time. But like maybe there are people out there who have incentives to do that or see some benefits out of it. So I think the technical part is not so far. I think the why is the kind of the main thing, the blocker, if I may say. But yeah, apparently it's sometimes people see a need in duplicating these projects.
Right. Cool. Okay. So just to conclude, guys, as it's kind of coming to the towards the end here. Just kind of again very briefly, I think we've answered the question of kind of episodes continuing to be a model that we need to continue to work with and kind of being sustainable. But what's kind of some of the strategic advice that you'd give, Amanda, just very briefly from you, and we'll go around again.
Strategic in what way?
In terms of like enterprises, maybe sort of how can they sort of navigate through all these sort of difficulties?
I think what you ought to be looking at, depending on how you're using it, right? If you're using coding, you're selecting projects and products, that's one thing. If you have a vendor providing them to you and packaging it up, an SI or equivalent, different thing. You need to have your good policies and stuff in place. If you are choosing a single product, or if you want to build open source, I think you really have to think long and hard about your business model very early stage. You probably don't want to have one, you probably want to have multiple, because you don't know what's actually going to stick over time. And you need to really understand what you're getting yourself into before you do it, because there are benefits and there are downsides. And if you don't think you can commercialize it, don't open source it. Because what you're going to see with vendors, I think, and this is the advice to the users, sorry, is I think users are going to get wary. Alexa, stop. Sorry. I think users are going to get wary, and in getting wary, they're going to start looking at projects, and the ones that are higher risk are the projects that have a single vendor. That will be exactly the kind of model most companies are looking at. And they're going to look at that kind of community and make an assessment before they use or become very reliant on your project. And also, you now have I think James Governor described it as the hammer of Valky, the potential for your users to fork you back.
Yeah, and forking kind of being the I think you guys called it the nuclear option, which was quite interesting. Cheryl, what's your sort of strategic advice?
Don't really have anything more to add to that. I think Amanda summed it up really well from all the different viewpoints. But as I said, I believe in open source as a common good, and this is not, even though we've talked sort of somewhat negatively here, this is not to say that this is not the way forwards, because I think it still is. So yeah, we just have to find a way through.
Cool. Cristian, very briefly from you as well, please.
Yeah, I mean, for me, as Cheryl was saying, this like foundation of open source is something that everybody should invest in, and ideally, I would like to see companies donating a percentage of the revenue they make to these projects they end up using behind the scenes. And if they fail to do that, I think I'd like to see more of this trend that Amanda was saying about the governments, the state intervening and taking their tax money and then funneling it through to open source developers that maintain those foundational projects. So I'd like to see that maybe more going forward if companies do not step up to maintain these things. Because at the end of the day, there will be more and more new projects that come in the hype areas like AI, but there's always going to be the OpenSSL and the whatever foundational projects that everybody's using that get unmaintained, or like there was this case with the compression library XZ, if I'm not mistaken, last year, where there was a situation where somebody was a state actor was impersonating somebody to like get into the project and do some shady things.
Right.
So it's always this risk for companies, and I would like to see more investment in those things.
Sure. Excellent. Okay. Well, I'm sure we can continue talking about this for a lot longer, but I think we'll stop there for now. And yeah, maybe we can actually revisit the topic and kind of see how things we kind of progress into the future. So yeah, I just want to say thank you everybody for your contributions. Really great opinions, fantastic insights. Links to everybody will be in the description of the video, so do check out everybody's websites and some things, whatever else they get up to when they're not on the Cloud Therapist channel. And yeah, let us know your thoughts as well. So we'd love to hear from you guys. Are you actually impacted by any of this? So it'll be really cool to hear maybe some of your comments as well. That's all for now. Thanks everybody, and we'll see you next time. Thank you for watching. Please don't forget to subscribe to the channel to support me. You may also want to check out some of the other videos on this channel. Bye for now.